He stood in court like the verdict had already favored him. Custom suit, silent smirk, and the posture of a man who thought silence was surrender. She walked in alone. No entourage, no gloss, no fear. And when the judge asked if she had anything to say, she simply shook her head. 2 hours later, her laugh, barefoot on a billionaire's jet, was all the internet could talk about. Sometimes, power isn't loud. Sometimes, it's a woman who says nothing and still wins everything. Welcome back to Mr. Charles Stories. This is where dignity outlasts damage, and true strength doesn't always make noise. If you've ever stayed quiet when the world wanted you to scream, this story will stay with you. If silence ever saved your peace, hit that like button now. If someone tried to define your worth by their narrative, don't scroll away. You're home here. Let's begin. The gallery was nearly full. Press, investors, 2 podcast hosts, a few former classmates of Darren Vale, now there to witness what they expected to be a clean-cut legal win. At the center stood Darren, one of Los Angeles' most prominent tech investors. His eyes already scanning the crowd, confident, calculating. Mara Quinlan stood just behind him, his assistant-turned-partner, flawless in tailored, beige, holding a folded statement Darren would soon deliver to the court. Then she walked in, Celine Ardell. Her entrance wasn't grand. In fact, most people didn't even notice at first. She wore no designer logo, no statement heels, no perfume cloud behind her. But as she passed row by row, people turned. There was something different about her, not defeated, not destroyed. Still, the kind of stillness you'd see in women who had already survived their worst moment and knew the courtroom wasn't it. She sat, alone. No legal team, no emotional support friend, no family, only her. And that navy blue dress that didn't try to impress. Darren looked over his shoulder once. She didn't meet his eyes. He smirked anyway, whispered something to Mara, but his foot tapped. 1, 2, pause. Then again, Celine caught it. It wasn't nerves, it was habit. Darren hated silence unless he controlled it. She once told him years ago, on their 3rd date, that she found power in silence. He called it poetic, then married her, then drowned her out. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Darren straightened his spine. Celine blinked once and followed suit. No one knew that 5 years ago, he proposed to her on the balcony of her old apartment, holding a yellow legal pad with a list of 20 reasons they balanced each other. She was calm. He was sharp. She believed in people. He believed in plans. She read fiction. He made contracts. It worked, until he stopped listening. Darren's legal team spoke first, a well-crafted narrative about the amicable nature of the separation. That Celine had been offered fair terms, that she wished to keep things private, that the couple had simply grown apart. He described her as deeply respectable and thanked her for her discretion. Celine didn't flinch, because it wasn't respect, it was branding. Ms. Ardell, the judge said calmly, do you have anything you wish to state? The room quieted. Even Darren's tapping stopped. Celine stood. She didn't clear her throat, didn't shuffle papers, didn't look for approval. She simply held the judge's gaze, nodded once, and shook her head, no. The judge raised a brow. You're declining to respond? Another slow nod. She sat. The silence that followed cracked louder than any gavel. Darren expected backlash, expected a monologue, maybe even a letter. He had rehearsed possible counters. Instead, he got her silence. And the public began to wonder, why? One reporter mouthed, she didn't say a word. Another checked their phone, typing Celine Ardell courtroom silence. A third scrolled Instagram and saw it. A video posted just the night before. No caption, just a woman twirling, barefoot on a private jet, laughing like freedom itself. 12 seconds long. One viewer zoomed in. Wait, is that her? By the time the hearing adjourned, the video had hit 1 million views. By sunset, it was 7. By sunrise, everyone had the same question. How does a woman walk out of a silent courtroom and still win the internet? As Darren spoke to his team and posed briefly for a photo outside, Celine exited through the back. A young girl held up her phone. "Miss Ardell, is that really you in the jet video?" Celine glanced at it, recognized the gold lights, the leather carpet, smiled. "Maybe," and for the first time in a year, she laughed. The girl who held the phone didn't ask again. She just smiled, her cheeks flushed as if she'd seen something sacred. And maybe she had, because Celine's laugh didn't sound rehearsed. It didn't sound like someone trying to reclaim anything. It sounded like a woman who had already let go. The press didn't get their photo. She slid into the back of a black town car with tinted windows and disappeared down the service road behind the courthouse. The silence in the car was thick, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind she liked, a kind she hadn't heard in years. The driver glanced at her once in the mirror. She met his eyes. "No stops," she said. He nodded. Nothing else needed to be said. Celine leaned her head against the window and watched downtown Los Angeles shrink behind her. The glass was cool. She closed her eyes. In another timeline, she might have cried. In this one, she rested. Darren wouldn't understand it. He'd think she was still processing, that she'd been too shocked to speak, that maybe her silence was a tactical retreat. But it wasn't. It was the final chapter of a book she'd already closed. He hadn't read her in years anyway. Back at the courthouse, Darren was already frustrated. Reporters kept asking about a video he didn't understand. Someone whispered to him that Celine's name was trending. His jaw locked. He hated unpredictability. Celine used to calm that in him. She used to know when to hold his hand, when to push back, when to stay up with him until 3 a.m., reading his proposals, just so he didn't feel alone in his climb. He used to tell her she made silence feel safe, and then he outgrew her, or so he told himself. He called Mara. She didn't answer. She'd started pulling away since the video dropped. She didn't like being part of a narrative where the ex-wife was universally adored. It didn't look good for her new wardrobe or her brand partnerships. Darren looked at his phone again. Still no reply from Celine. His text from the night before remained unread. You could have told them the truth. But the truth had already gone viral. That night, Celine sat on the floor of her loft in Los Feliz, barefoot, with a mug of ginger tea and 2 candles lit in opposite corners of the room. She didn't like bright light at night. She liked shadows and flickers. It reminded her of campfires and paperback novels, safe spaces. The loft was quiet. No staff, no security, just wide windows and a breeze that moved through without resistance. She was no longer a wife, no longer Mrs. Vale, but she was still Celine Ardell. And that meant something again. The door buzzed once. She already knew who it was. She didn't check. Lucas stood on the other side, holding 2 containers, one with soup, one with fresh sourdough from a place in Silver Lake. He didn't smile big, just nodded once as she opened the door. "You said you didn't eat at the courthouse," he said. "I didn't." "Then this isn't a courtesy. It's a necessity." She stepped aside, and he walked in. That's all it took. He wasn't flashy, never had been. He owned buildings in cities she'd never visited, invested in energy markets she barely understood. But he never explained his life with arrogance. He moved through the world like a man who knew power didn't need to be proven. He placed the food on the kitchen island and opened the soup. She noticed he still wore the same watch he'd had 5 years ago when they met at the museum benefit, the one with the cracked leather strap. She poured him tea without asking. They ate in silence. But it wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. "You're trending," he finally said. "I know. Feel anything?" "I feel clear." He didn't press. She could have told him that her inbox was full. That morning shows wanted her to speak. That book agents were offering 7-figure deals for her to write her truth. She didn't want it. She didn't want revenge in the form of a memoir. She didn't want her voice to be reduced to sound bites or montages. What she wanted was already around her, stillness, a clean apartment, and a man who didn't interrupt her quiet. After they ate, they sat on the floor. Lucas leaned his head against the wall, stretching his legs in front of him. She curled her knees to her chest. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. "No." "Okay." That was all. They watched the candlelight dance on the windows. The city moved around them, unaware, uncaring. And still, Celine didn't feel small. She felt rooted. He reached over and took her hand slowly. No urgency, no need for a reaction. Her fingers wrapped around his. She didn't flinch. Somewhere in the city, Darren stared at his ceiling. The lights were off, but the room wasn't dark. The LED on the projector blinked in rhythm. 1 second on, 1 second off. 1 second on, 1 second off. Each blink reminded him of something he couldn't name. He had tried to find control again, tried to reach out to his PR team, to book an interview, to explain himself. But they advised against it, said the optics were already fragile, that anything he said would look like retaliation. He hated that word, retaliation, as if he was the villain. He wasn't. He just got tired. Tired of carrying someone who didn't understand his goals. Tired of feeling emotionally obligated to show up when his mind was already stretched. Tired of Celine's quiet judgments. He had loved her once. But she made him feel small when she didn't say what she was thinking. When she just watched him, like she knew he was lying before he even finished his sentence. Now the whole world looked at him like that. 1 second on, 1 second off. And he knew, somewhere in his mind, that she hadn't said a single word. But they still chose her. Lucas left the loft around midnight. No kiss, just a long look. "I'll see you soon," he said. "Drive safe," she replied. When the door shut behind him, she locked it quietly, walked back to the window, stood barefoot on the cool wood floors, and let the city stretch out beneath her. Tomorrow would come. The noise would rise again. But tonight was hers. She wasn't going to explain the jet video. She wasn't going to speak on behalf of anyone else's assumptions. Because the truth was simple. She laughed that day because she was finally light enough to do it. No weight of performance, no scripted strength. Just air, just her, just freedom. And the world heard it, without needing subtitles. Have you ever stayed quiet? Not because you were weak, but because you were already done. If that silence ever protected your peace, type "I chose quiet" in the comments. Tap the like button if you've ever walked away from noise and found power in doing nothing. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories, where strength whispers and dignity always speaks last. Celine didn't sleep through the night, but she wasn't restless either. She lay in bed, watching the ceiling, her fingers gently grazing the linen sheets she had picked out herself. Soft grey, cool to the skin. No one had told her they looked elegant. No one had to. She liked them. That was enough. The clock blinked 3:47 a.m. She blinked back. And for the first time in a long time, there was no weight on her chest. No need to explain. No one beside her breathing a little too loud. Scrolling through emails with the screen too bright. She was alone, but she wasn't lonely. In the morning, the sun slipped across the hardwood in slow gold stripes. She padded barefoot across the floor to the kitchen and turned on the kettle. The sound of water boiling filled the silence with something comforting. She didn't check her phone. She didn't need to know how many views the video had now, or what people were saying. She didn't care if podcasts were dissecting her life, or if online forums were building timelines of her last 3 years. She cared about her team, the sound of the city waking up, and the manuscript waiting on her desk, one she'd been editing for. A first-time author writing about surviving life after foster care. Celine still had a business to run. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a celebrity. She was a woman who walked away, and now she had work to do. At 9:12 a.m., the intercom buzzed. A package delivery. She thanked the courier through the speaker and went downstairs. A pale green box sat on the lobby table. No name. Just a handwritten note inside. You still deserve softness. L. She didn't need to guess who it was from. She lifted the lid and found a stack of hand-bound journals made from recycled pages, the kind she liked. No lines, thick pages, uneven edges. Celine held them like they were something sacred, and in a way they were. By 11, she was already at her desk, hair pinned back, reading through character notes and circling overused adjectives in red. She never edited with judgment, only curiosity. Why did she use this word 4 times in one paragraph? She murmured aloud. No one answered, and that was fine. There was peace in self-dialogue when no one was trying to interrupt it with strategy or spin. A chime on her laptop reminded her of a video call scheduled for noon. She debated cancelling. Her client was based in Chicago and likely hadn't expected her to take the meeting anyway, given the news cycle. But Celine clicked join exactly at 12. Celine? The woman on the other side looked surprised. I didn't think you'd show. Why not? I mean, the story, the video. I just assumed. I don't cancel work for chaos, Celine said gently. Let's talk about your chapters. The client smiled. They spent 45 minutes discussing plot inconsistencies, dialogue flow, and a subplot involving a misplaced child in a hospital waiting room. Celine was sharp, focused, calm. It wasn't performative. It was her nature. And when the call ended, the client sat back in her own chair, stunned that someone the internet couldn't stop talking about had spent an hour focused entirely on someone else's story. Celine didn't tell her that it helped. That editing grounded her, that being part of someone else's arc felt safer than reliving her own. She simply closed her laptop and went to wash her tea mug. Outside her building, a black SUV had been parked since morning. Not paparazzi, not press, just a car with tinted windows and a man in a charcoal coat sitting inside. Lucas, he hadn't texted, hadn't called, but she knew he'd wait. At 4:06, she stepped out of the building, hair still pinned, scarf knotted tight around her neck. No sunglasses, no mask. She walked to the car like it wasn't a surprise. He opened the door before she reached it. Drive? She nodded. They didn't say where. He didn't need to ask. They drove east, past Echo Park, then south, through empty industrial roads where warehouses gave way to quiet. Do you remember this route? He asked finally. She looked out the window. The bridge coming up. Yeah, 5 years ago. That art installation with the burning piano. He smiled. You told me silence had layers that night. I stand by it. I know. They parked near the overpass and sat with the windows down. A slow breeze filtered in. Celine leaned back, head tilted toward the sky. Lucas didn't talk. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't tell her how brave she was, or how Darren was unraveling. He let her exist. And that was the most romantic thing he could have done. He pulled a book from the side compartment. I found a copy of that memoir you mentioned, he said. The one from the author in Brazil? Celine's eyes lit up. The original printing, first edition. She took it carefully, as if it might fall apart in her hands. Lucas watched her open the first page, watched her fingertips brush the spine. You know, she said, the last time someone gave me a book, they told me it was to help me grow beyond my current perspective. He raised a brow. Darren? She nodded. What's this one for? Lucas shrugged. To remind you, you never needed fixing. She looked down at the book again, held it against her chest. For once, she didn't have words, and that was okay. They drove back at sunset. The city looked different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The skyline wasn't a reminder of all she had lost. It was a reminder that she could breathe again. The loft smelled like eucalyptus when she opened the door. She'd left the oil diffuser running. Lucas followed her in, silent as always, setting the book down on her desk like it belonged there. She turned to him, finally. You want to stay for dinner? I brought soup again. She smiled. They didn't cook. They didn't dress up. They ate on the floor again, back against the couch, knees almost touching. She didn't tell him thank you. She didn't need to. Some people don't show up with fanfare. They show up with presence. And in a world that always asked her to explain herself, Lucas Stray never once asked her to justify her stillness. He matched it, and sometimes that's the only way you know it's real. It rained the next morning. Soft, measured rainfall that tapped gently against the wide glass windows of Celine's loft. She didn't open the curtains. She liked the dimness, the slow shadows that stretched across the shelves, painting everything in tones of calm. Lucas was still there. He had slept on the couch, his coat draped over him like a blanket, shoes placed neatly by the leg. Celine stepped quietly into the kitchen, careful not to wake him, and poured water into the kettle. The scent of early jasmine tea filled the space. She moved with precision. Boil. Steep. Pour. No rush. No noise. Lucas stirred around the time she opened the window slightly to let the scent of rain mix with the eucalyptus from the night before. "You always move like the day hasn't started yet," he murmured. She turned, surprised he was awake. "I like slow starts." He sat up, stretched, and reached for his shoes without speaking further. But before he slipped them on, he paused. "Do you miss him?" Celine didn't answer right away. She poured a second cup of tea, handed it to him, then leaned against the counter with her own. "I miss who I thought he was." Lucas nodded. "That's honest. I kept waiting for the version of him that used to care. But the truth is, I think that man disappeared years ago, or never existed." She didn't fight that idea, because some truths don't need protecting. They drank their tea quietly. Lucas stood not long after, buttoned his coat, and kissed her forehead without asking for permission. Just one soft press, deliberate, respectful, and gone too soon. She didn't stop him from leaving, but when the door closed, she exhaled through her nose, like her body had been holding something until she heard the latch click. By 10, the noise outside had returned. Emails, calls, interview requests, brand collaborations, offers from producers who wanted to turn her story into a limited series. She replied to none. Instead, she opened a new manuscript from her inbox, a debut novel by a woman from Detroit who'd spent 3 years in silence. After leaving a high-profile executive with a spotless record and a history of emotional manipulation behind closed doors, Celine read the first chapter, then the second. By the fourth, she was crying quietly, not for herself, but for the writer who had put pieces of her own pain into something brave. She picked up her pen and began making notes in the margins. Not edits, but encouragements. "You don't have to push harder here. It's already strong. Keep this line. It echoes what you said in chapter 1. Smart. This moment? It's enough. Don't over-explain it. Trust the reader." She worked for hours, and when she finished, she sat back and let the tears fall freely. Not because she was hurting, but because something inside her had opened again. She was still capable of connecting, still capable of witnessing someone else's pain without collapsing under her own. That night, she lit 3 candles instead of 2, not for ceremony, for warmth. Lucas didn't come over, and she didn't expect him to. She needed to feel this night for herself. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. The sky was still streaked with grey, but the rain had stopped. She dressed simply, black trousers, soft cream sweater, scarf knotted loosely around her neck. She tied her hair back with a single clip and looked at herself in the mirror for longer than usual, not to check her appearance, to recognize it. This woman wasn't broken. This woman had walked through a storm without shouting, without demanding attention, and still she had been heard. She picked up one of the journals Lucas had gifted her and slipped it into her bag. There was a gallery exhibit opening downtown, one she'd been invited to months ago but never replied to. She went, alone. The space was clean, quiet, mostly natural light. The exhibit focused on silence in visual art, sculptures with no labels, canvases painted in near, monochrome, installations that asked viewers to write nothing, say nothing, and simply stand. She walked through the rooms with slow steps. At one point, a woman approached her. Kind face, no camera. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said quietly. "Not for the video, for the silence. Celine nodded, accepting the words without needing to respond. Not everyone needed a quote. Later, as she stood near a corner piece, a statue of a woman with her mouth covered in silk, someone tapped her shoulder. She turned. Darren. No cameras, no audience. Just him, in a dark coat and eyes that looked like they hadn't rested. Didn't expect to find you here, he said. I didn't plan to be found, she replied. He looked around the room. They're all watching you. They're watching art. You always had a way of turning pain into a gallery piece. She didn't respond. He stepped closer. I didn't think it would become what it did. I know. I'm not the monster they've made me out to be. I know that too. Then, why didn't you tell them? Why didn't you speak? Celine tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. Because I already told myself the truth. I didn't owe it to anyone else. Darren blinked, unsettled by her steadiness. You made me look like a coward. I didn't make you look like anything. I just stopped explaining. He looked at her like he wanted to argue. Then he didn't. Instead, he stepped back and nodded once. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I already have. He turned to leave. And as he walked out of the gallery, Celine turned back to the statue. She wasn't the woman with silk across her mouth anymore. She had taken that off the moment she stopped trying to fix someone else's version of love. She had nothing to prove now. When she got home that evening, she opened the journal from her bag. Wrote one line. Sometimes the quietest chapters are the ones that change the whole book. She closed it, set it on her nightstand, and smiled. The weather warmed slightly the next day. Sunlight crept through the loft windows with a gentleness Celine hadn't felt in months. She let it in, didn't draw the curtains. She stood barefoot on the floor and let the light hit her arms, her face, her collarbone. She didn't flinch from it. After the gallery moment with Darren, she hadn't replayed the encounter. She hadn't rehearsed new responses in her head. She hadn't rushed to call Lucas or anyone. There was nothing to dissect, nothing to fix. She had said what she meant, and that had been enough. By 8 a.m., she was already at her desk, editing again. A different manuscript this time. One by a retired teacher writing about the quiet fallout of caregiving. Not dramatic, just honest. Celine liked stories that didn't scream for attention. She circled a paragraph where the author had tried to justify her exhaustion with statistics. Celine wrote gently in the margin, "You don't need numbers to validate your burnout. The truth is already visible." She sat back for a moment, eyes scanning her studio. It was filled with things that meant something. A pressed flower between two sheets of glass. A framed rejection letter from her first novel submission, signed with encouragement. A Polaroid of her mother holding a cup of coffee in a winter coat, smiling like she knew something no one else did. Celine didn't need noise. She needed meaning. By mid-morning, she heard her phone buzz. Not from across the room, not in a dramatic way. Just once, a name appeared. Lucas. She smiled before answering. "You're early," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that like it was a good thing. It is. I'm 2 blocks away." "Coffee?" "Yes." He didn't say more. She didn't need more. 15 minutes later, she stepped outside. Lucas was leaning against his car, holding 2 cups, black lids, no logos. He handed her one, then looked at her scarf. "I liked the green one from last week," he said casually. She raised an eyebrow, noted. They walked without destination. The streets were alive again, but not overwhelming. A mother guided her toddler across the sidewalk. A fruit vendor restocked his crates. A man with silver headphones nodded to a rhythm only he could hear. Celine sipped her coffee and breathed deeply. Lucas noticed. "You're lighter," she nodded. "Seeing Darren again didn't pull you under?" "No," she said softly, "because I finally saw him clearly. Without the old lens." They walked in silence for another block. "I used to think love meant always seeing the best in someone," she continued. "But real love, mature love, means seeing the whole person and choosing whether or not to stay." Lucas stopped walking. She turned to look at him. "I see the whole you," he said. She didn't reply. She just stepped forward and kissed him, not out of impulse, but with clarity, the kind that didn't tremble. They stood on the corner for a while after that, talking about nothing and everything, books, tea flavors, a new exhibit at the museum she wanted to visit. Lucas asked nothing about the internet, the courtroom, the old marriage, because he knew she was more than the narrative people were watching unfold. By afternoon, she was home again. She didn't need to write a press release or respond to the dozens of brands reaching out. She didn't need to craft a message about her journey. She just needed to reply to an email from a young author in Seattle who had thanked her for publishing her poem after 4 journals said no. Celine wrote back personally, "You don't need a big platform to matter. You matter because your voice holds weight, whether 5 people hear it or 5 million. She hit send, then stood, stretched, and walked to her small balcony overlooking the alley behind her building. She liked that it didn't face the main street. She liked that the view was just sky and wires, and the occasional bird resting on a ledge. She pulled the green scarf from her closet and draped it around her shoulders, and for a moment she laughed quietly to herself. Lucas had noticed it, not because it was bright, but because it was hers. Later that night, she cooked. She hadn't done that in a while. Roasted vegetables, garlic, lemon zest over farro. She played music softly from a speaker on the counter, jazz without vocals, just mood. She didn't expect company. But at 7:03 p.m., there was a knock, not the buzzer, a knock. She opened the door. Lucas stood there, holding a jar of pickled red onions and 2 wooden spoons. "You said the farro needed something sharp," he said. She grinned. "You're not wrong." He walked in like he belonged, and she let him. They ate at the kitchen counter this time. No candles, no staged silence, no playlist humming in the background. Just 2 bowls, 2 glasses of water, and the soft clink of spoons against ceramic. Lucas took a bite and nodded, impressed. "This is better than last time." "I didn't burn the farro this time," Celine said, lips twitching into a small smile. "You didn't tell me you burned it. You didn't ask." He laughed, then leaned back slightly on the stool, taking her in. "I think I like this version of you," he said. She raised a brow. "Which version? The one that doesn't shrink before speaking?" She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze dropped to her bowl for a beat. "I don't think I shrank," she said. "I think I folded. Folding still makes you smaller. But sometimes folding is survival. You fold to fit into the room, into the moment, into the version of love someone says is safe." Lucas didn't argue. He nodded slowly, understanding not just the words but the years behind them. They finished dinner without rushing. Lucas stood to wash the dishes without being asked, and Celine let him. She sat at the counter, watching him move around her kitchen, like someone who knew where everything belonged but waited to be told. "Stay," she said softly. He dried his hands on a towel and turned. "Sure, I wouldn't ask if I wasn't." He walked to her slowly, no sudden moves, no assumptions. When he reached her, she placed her hands on his waist first, gentle, then slid one up to his shoulder, anchoring herself. Lucas cupped her face with one hand, thumb brushing the edge of her cheekbone. Their kiss was slow, unrushed, a kind of connection that felt less about claiming, and more about acknowledging what had already been quietly building. They didn't need words. They just needed time. Later, in the quiet of her bedroom, Celine rested her head against his chest. The rhythm of his breathing calmed her more than any meditation track ever could. She didn't feel like she owed him anything. Not performance, not explanation, and that was the difference. In her marriage, even the softest touches had come with terms, with hidden expectations, with unspoken consequences. With Lucas, there was only presence. In the morning, he made coffee while she answered 2 emails. He didn't ask about them. He didn't peer over her shoulder or question her tone. He just handed her a cup and said, "You've got ink on your hand." She laughed. She hadn't noticed. "You're becoming more of yourself every day," he said. She looked at him closely. "What does that mean?" "You're not editing your reactions anymore. You're not holding your breath. You're living." Celine sat with that. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, and it felt true. At 11 a.m., she received a call from a journalist with a major platform, one who promised fairness, who said they weren't looking for a story, just a real human angle. Celine didn't answer. She sent a short text instead. "I don't need to be explained. Thank you for respecting that," they replied once. "We'll be here if you ever change your mind." But she wouldn't. That afternoon, Celine visited the local independent bookstore she used to go to every month. The owner, a woman in her 70s named Hilda, hadn't changed a bit. "Celine," she said with a grin, "haven't seen you in a while." "Needed quiet," Celine replied. Hilda nodded, pulling a stool from behind the counter. "You always liked the kind of stories that didn't need to shout." "I still do." She browsed the back section for nearly an hour, collecting 3 poetry collections and 1 rare short story anthology from a small press in Toronto. Before she left, Hilda stopped her. "I saw the clip," she said gently. Celine looked at her, ready to deflect, but Hilda simply added, "You looked free." Celine smiled. "I was." When she got home, Lucas had already left a note on her kitchen counter. "Dinner later this week? I owe you a burned version of this exact meal. I'll bring the smoke alarm." She laughed out loud, folded the note, tucked it into the spine of a book on her shelf. Not everything had to be spoken. Some things could live between pages. That evening, Celine curled up on her couch with one of the poetry books. The author wrote about grief as a room you redecorate slowly. And as she read, Celine realized she had spent the last year redecorating her silence, not into noise, but into something sturdy. She had filled the room with boundaries, with truth, with softness that didn't require permission, with love that didn't punish her for needing space. And for the first time, her silence wasn't lonely. It was hers. Darren Vale sat in the glass-walled office of his media advisor, staring at a paused frame from the now viral Jet video. It was frozen on her laugh, not the kind she used to give him in the early days, the careful, closed, mouth smile she offered at dinners when he made some clever remark. No, this laugh had her head tilted back, eyes nearly shut, joy blooming from the center of her chest, like she'd finally remembered what it meant to breathe without flinching. He hated it, not because she looked happy, but because she looked untouchable. "You can't spin this anymore," his advisor said gently, clicking off the video. "There's no statement you can release that won't make you look like the Billionaire'S. I didn't ask for spin. You asked for control. Same thing." Darren didn't respond. The room went quiet. Outside, cars passed by on Wilshire. His empire wasn't crumbling, not financially, but the credibility, the image he'd built with such precision, it was cracking. Not because she said anything, but because she didn't. He had underestimated what silence could do. In the past, silence had been his weapon. Delays in email replies, strategic pauses in meetings, letting people sweat before delivering an answer. But Celine's silence wasn't calculated. It was dignified, and dignity couldn't be rebranded. He stood abruptly. "Cancel the profile feature with Chronicle. They already pulled out." Darren blinked. "What?" "They said they want to avoid the wrong kind of spotlight." He left without another word. In the elevator, his reflection stared back at him, perfectly groomed, expensive, exhausted. He used to like this mirror. It made him feel powerful, framed his ambition like art. Today, it showed a man trying to outrun a truth that had no volume and no timestamp. A man who had everything except peace. Across the city, Celine walked through the small farmer's market near Silver Lake Reservoir. No one approached her. A few eyes lingered, but most let her move through the space without disruption. She liked it that way. She sampled fresh pears from a stand she hadn't visited in years, bought 2 loaves of sourdough and a small jar of pomegranate jam. When the vendor handed her the change, he smiled and said, "You seem lighter." She didn't ask what he meant. She just smiled back. "Feels like it." Lucas called while she walked home. "I booked a gallery showing in March," he said. She could hear the caution in his tone, like he wasn't sure she'd want to be seen with him in public now. "With your own work?" "Photography," he confirmed. "I want to see it," she said. His breath caught slightly. She heard it. He didn't hide it. "I'll send the invite. No need. I'm already coming." She ended the call and walked the final 2 blocks with the sun warming her back. By the time she reached her building, 2 new messages waited on her phone. One from an author she mentored 5 years ago, thanking her for changing the direction of her life, and one from an unknown number. "Darren, you're winning. Hope it's worth it." She stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She didn't need to win. She just needed to stop losing herself. Later that day, she received an invitation to speak at a women's literature conference in San Diego. Keynote speaker, paid, full rights control. She stared at the email, blinking. Public speaking wasn't her favorite, but this time, it felt less like performance, more like presence. She replied, yes. Lucas arrived that evening with Thai takeout and 2 books under his arm. One was a photography collection. The other, a first edition novel she'd been trying to find for over a year. "You're spoiling me," she said. "You've been undersold too long," he replied. They didn't talk about Darren. They didn't need to. They spent the night discussing the lighting in Lucas's new photo series, the symbolism in forgotten staircases, the loneliness in abandoned chairs, and somewhere between dessert and the second glass of wine, Lucas touched her face with both hands and kissed her slow, like he knew she didn't belong to anyone anymore, not even her past. Celine let him hold her, not because she needed comfort, but because she chose him. When the night ended, they lay side by side, the city humming quietly outside. And for the first time in years, Celine didn't feel like her life was waiting to begin again. It already had. She arrived early to the literature conference in San Diego, not because she was nervous, but because she hated rushing. She always had. Darren used to tease her for it, calling her anxiously early. Lucas, on the other hand, had texted her that morning. Early is elegance. She wore navy slacks, a soft cream blouse, and no makeup, besides a warm lip tint. Her hair was tied loosely at the nape. She didn't try to dress for attention. She never had. Still, when she walked through the hotel lobby and into the conference wing, heads turned. It wasn't about fame. It was about peace. People recognized it on her. The moderator met her at the side of the stage, a younger woman, clearly flustered with last-minute notes and mic checks. "I'm so honored you said yes," she gushed. "We kept refreshing your inbox for days." Celine smiled, easy and kind. "I wasn't ignoring. I was deciding. I hope it didn't feel like pressure. No, it felt like a chance to use silence the way I want to." The moderator paused, then nodded like she understood. "Ready whenever you are." Celine stepped onto the stage with no introduction. The room was full. Authors, editors, students, community leaders. She didn't hold a paper, didn't carry notes, just looked out at them, waited for the room to quiet, and when it did, she said, "I'm not here to tell you my story. You've already heard it." A few chuckles, some nods. "I'm here to remind you that your silence is not your failure. It is not your weakness. Sometimes, it's your refusal to play someone else's game." The room stilled again. Celine continued, steady and clear. "There are people who will call you cold because you don't explain. There are people who will question your value because you left quietly. And there are people who will feel entitled to your breakdown because they missed the part where you were breaking." She paused. "And I'm here to tell you, you don't owe them that moment." The audience held its breath. Celine closed her eyes once, opened them again. "You get to write your own version, and if you do it well enough, it won't need a voiceover. They'll feel it in the silence between your sentences." No one clapped. Not immediately. It wasn't that kind of speech. It was the kind that needed a second to land. Then the applause came, loud, long, and honest. She stepped down without bowing, without taking a selfie. Just walked backstage and found the quiet again. Later, she signed copies of her published titles, anthologies, editorials, and new author collections she helped launch. she didn't sit behind a long table. She stood, book in hand, meeting each person eye to eye. "Thank you for what you're building," one woman whispered. "Your silence taught me more than my therapist," said another. Celine listened to all of them, didn't deflect, didn't diminish their gratitude. She accepted it, not as praise, but as proof. She returned to her loft the next morning. Lucas had left a plant by her door. No card, just a sticky note that read, "For your windowsill." Quiet company. She smiled, unlocked the door, and carried it inside. That afternoon, she received a letter, a real one, postmarked and handwritten in blue ink. The envelope had no return address. Inside, a single page. "You never raised your voice, and still, you changed the room. I don't like how you did it, but I respect it now." Celine read it once, then again. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She folded it and slid it into the back of one of her journals. Not to revisit it, not to preserve it, but because even closure has its place. Later that week, Lucas invited her to his studio for the first time. It was a converted warehouse space, white walls, soft light, canvases and photographs pinned neatly in rows. She walked through slowly. Each piece had its own silence. Still chairs, forgotten corners, shoes left near cracked windows. "Why do you photograph what's left behind?" she asked him. "Because stillness reveals what movement hides." She looked at him. "That's why I like your work. You're not just in it," he said. "You are it." She moved toward one canvas that hadn't been hung yet. A single black chair in the middle of an empty room. The caption scrawled in the corner. She stopped waiting. Celine touched the frame lightly. Lucas came beside her, their arms brushing. "I want to buy this one," she said softly. "It's yours. I mean it. Don't gift it to me. Let me honor it." He nodded, then pulled a folded receipt from his pocket and passed it to her. Already signed, already dated. She unfolded it. The price line read, "One life well lived." She looked up at him. "You planned that. I hoped for it." She didn't kiss him. She simply took his hand, held it tight, and whispered, "Then let's build it." Celine spent the next few weeks slowly rearranging her world, not with grand gestures or announcements. She didn't make a vision board, didn't take a reclaiming season trip to Europe. She started smaller. She changed the placement of her desk. It used to face the wall, neat and tucked. Now it faced the window, where sunlight could spill across her drafts and coffee cups. She swapped out the old office chair for one that didn't squeak every time she exhaled. She deleted folders she no longer needed, old contracts, duplicates of edited manuscripts she'd already published, notes from her last years with Darren that she kept, just in case. In case of what? She didn't know anymore. And she donated the last dress she wore to one of his company's galas. It had fit her body, but never her voice. Her days became full in a different way. Phone calls with authors, interviews she gave selectively, moments where she found herself writing again, not just editing. She hadn't realized how much she'd stopped creating, how much of herself she'd put on pause to manage someone else's tempo. Now, the music was hers. She wrote short stories that started without direction and ended with clarity. She found characters who didn't need to yell to be heard. Women who moved through their pain without spectacle, who chose dignity over closure, who laughed on private jets without knowing someone had a camera running. Lucas continued to show up in quiet ways, never overwhelming, always consistent. They didn't need to see each other every day. When they did, it was natural. A slow dinner, a bookstore trip, a shared coffee, while working separately at opposite ends of her apartment. Celine found comfort in that kind of closeness, the kind that didn't ask for permission to breathe. One night while reading in bed, she looked up from the page and said, "I think I want to host a workshop." Lucas glanced up from the photo book in his lap. "For writers?" "Yes, specifically for women who've left something behind, a marriage, a job, a silence." He nodded slowly. "What would you call it?" She smiled. "Margins." He grinned. Because that's where most of us write ourselves. Exactly. She opened a notebook and began jotting down ideas. Not for an empire, not for a movement, just for something real. A space, a room where people could sit, write, and not explain themselves. 3 days later, she emailed a few local venues, reached out to small networks, created a form, kept it all simple. Within 48 hours, the list had over 70 names, some with long bios, some with just one sentence. "I need somewhere to speak quietly." Celine read that line twice. That was the whole message. She got it. The first workshop was scheduled for the following Saturday. 10 women. Folding chairs, notebooks provided, no live stream, no media, just paper and space. On the morning of the event, Celine arrived early, carrying a box of handmade journals and a basket of chamomile tea sachets. The venue was a community hall with wide windows and old wooden floors, the kind of place where stories wanted to live. Lucas showed up uninvited. He didn't speak. He just helped her move the chairs into a circle and kissed the top of her head before slipping out. By noon, they had started. The women came in one by one, some cautious, some eager. Most of them didn't introduce themselves by profession or relationship status. They said things like, "I stopped talking 6 months ago. I just got tired of justifying. I left and didn't pack my voice." Celine didn't ask for more. She handed them each a journal and simply said, "Write what doesn't ask for permission." For the next 2 hours, no one tried to lead. There were no writing prompts, no icebreakers, only silence, punctuated by pen strokes, page turns, and the sound of healing happening in real time. By the end, one woman stood and said, "I forgot what it felt like to be trusted with my own words." Another added, "I've never heard a room so quiet that wasn't filled with tension." Celine nodded. "That's because this silence doesn't punish. It protects." No one clapped. They just stood together for a moment, like something important had shifted. Then they left, quietly, one by one, some hugging, some just offering a nod of thanks. Celine stayed behind to clean up. She didn't rush. She moved the chairs back to their original spots, packed the unused journals, poured the last of the tea into a thermos. Lucas came back as the sky dimmed. "Good silence?" he asked. "The best kind." They walked out together. Later that night, as they sat in her living room, Lucas looked over and asked, "Do you miss being loud?" She thought about it, then shook her head. "I think I was only ever loud when I felt unseen." "You're seen now." "I know." She leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. And in that quiet, in that stillness, she knew she hadn't won because of a video. She hadn't risen because of public opinion. She had survived because she remembered who she was when no one was watching. And now that the world was looking, she still didn't need to explain. The second workshop filled up in under an hour. Celine hadn't even posted about it herself. A woman from the first gathering had shared her experience on a small community blog. No names, no drama. Just a paragraph about writing without being interrupted, about being heard, even in silence. That was all it took. Emails started flooding in, not asking for interviews, just for seats. Celine didn't change the format. Still 10 women. Still handwritten journals. Still tea. She turned down an offer from a national non-profit that offered to sponsor future workshops with branding alignment. She didn't want branding. She didn't want logos. She wanted the margins to stay clean. Lucas showed up again before the second workshop. Same role, no title. Helped with setup, kissed her once, left without needing thanks. After the group had left, Celine found a folded slip of paper on one of the empty chairs. No name, just a line in tight, slanted handwriting. "I used to think silence was punishment. Today, it felt like a room with the windows open." She pressed it into the back of her notebook. Another truth she didn't need to publicize. The next morning, she stood in her kitchen with the soft spring sun warming the countertop. Lucas stirred honey into 2 mugs of tea. She watched him. He didn't speak yet, just moved in rhythm, one spoon, then the other, then setting both cups side by side. "You're good at this," she said. "At tea, at staying." He looked at her then, carefully. "Is that still surprising?" She nodded. "A little. Why?" "Because I used to believe staying was the same thing as control. I stayed in places where I felt small because I thought leaving meant failure." Lucas didn't speak. He just passed her a cup and waited. Celine sipped slowly before continuing. "Now I know the difference. Staying is beautiful when it's voluntary, when it doesn't cost your voice. I'd never ask you to pay with that." "I know," she said softly. That evening, they visited an old used bookstore tucked behind a row of cafes in Culver City. Lucas had discovered it years ago, but never told anyone about it. He said it was too special to spoil. "You're the first person I've brought here," he told her as he held the door. Celine stepped inside and immediately understood. Dusty paper smell. A strange calm between shelves. Sections labeled in handwritten signs. Books that forgave me. Poems that should have been longer. Stories that ended too soon. She grinned. They walked in separate directions, meeting occasionally in the aisles, each carrying a book they didn't explain. At one point, she found Lucas sitting on the floor with a stack of photography books, flipping through one with a bent spine. She sat beside him, leaning her shoulder into his without a word. They didn't rush to buy anything, didn't even check the time. When they eventually left, Celine held 3 books in her arms. Lucas had 4. They walked back to the car in silence, a different kind of silence than she used to endure. This one was full. Lucas dropped her off at home around 9. She didn't invite him in, not because she didn't want to, but because tonight her silence was meant to be hers. She curled up on the couch, pulled one of the books into her lap, and began reading. Her phone buzzed once. A photo from Lucas, a grainy image of the aisle she had sat in. Captioned, "My favorite chapter." She didn't reply, just saved it, and smiled. The next morning, a woman from the 3rd workshop sent her an email. Short, no fluff. "You made me remember what my voice sounds like. Not on paper, in my chest." Celine reread it 3 times, then opened her manuscript folder. Not someone else's, her own. She hadn't touched her personal writing in years. She hadn't believed she had anything new to say. But now, she started with the word return, not as a title, not as a theme, as a promise. That afternoon, she turned down another interview request. A journalist had sent over a list of light, humanizing questions. Celine scanned the list. "What's your morning routine? What would you say to your younger self? What's your relationship status now?" She didn't answer. Instead, she opened a blank journal, wrote across the top, "What I would say to a woman who's still explaining herself to be taken seriously." She didn't finish the entry yet, but she would. The next weekend, she and Lucas drove out of the city. No destination, just road. They stopped at a fruit stand off the highway, picked up peaches and a jar of apple, butter, then continued driving until the roads narrowed and the air smelled cleaner. They found a small hiking trail by chance, walked in soft conversation. At one point, Celine paused and looked out at the view. Rolling fields, low mountains, sky too wide to capture. Lucas stood behind her, hands in his pockets. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I never knew how much I needed open space." He nodded. "And now?" he asked. She turned to him, sunlight brushing her face. "Now I know I was never asking for too much. I was just asking the wrong people." He stepped forward, brushed a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "You never have to explain again. I won't." And in that quiet space, with the wind moving through dry leaves, she kissed him again. Not for comfort, but because she could. Because nothing about her healing asked for permission anymore. Have you ever walked away from something and finally felt your voice return? If you've ever rebuilt your peace in quiet, comment, "I reclaimed my silence." Tap the like button if you've learned that healing doesn't always need headlines. And subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories, where every soft return matters more than the noise that came before. Celine didn't mean for the workshop to become a series, but by the 4th one, women started bringing their friends. sisters, co-workers. One woman brought her teenage daughter, who sat quietly in the corner and didn't write a single word, but cried during the closing circle. Celine didn't ask why. She just handed her a fresh journal and whispered, "You can begin when you're ready." That night, Celine sat on her balcony, wrapped in her old green scarf, watching the city breathe under a soft orange dusk. Lucas sat beside her, sketchbook in his lap. He didn't draw her often, but sometimes he'd draw around her. A chair, a coffee cup, a window cracked just enough to let the air in. "I think something's happening," Celine said. Lucas looked up. Pen paused. "With you? With the work? With these women? They're showing up differently. You're giving them a place to exist. I didn't expect that to matter so much." He closed the sketchbook, leaned back in the chair. "When someone builds a space that doesn't ask for performance," he said, "people learn how to show up as they are." Celine thought about that. She had spent years being performed with, posed beside, framed. Now, no one asked her to smile on cue. And still, she felt more seen than ever. Later that week, one of the workshop attendees sent her a letter, a real one, folded and handwritten, no email version attached. Inside was a single sentence. "I didn't speak for 12 years, but something you built cracked the seal." Celine held that note for a long time, then pinned it to her corkboard, beside the original proposal list Darren had written when they were engaged. She stared at both pieces of paper. How strange, she thought, that one held promises and the other held proof. She didn't need the list anymore, but she didn't remove it. It reminded her how far she'd come. She didn't have to burn the past to live in the present. She just had to stop returning to it for answers. That weekend, a local publication sent a request, not for a feature, but for permission, to include margins in a directory of community-led healing initiatives. Celine hesitated for a moment, then said yes, not for publicity, but for someone who might be scrolling at midnight, looking for a place that didn't ask them to justify their pain. When the listing went live, her inbox quietly changed, not with attention-seeking pitches, but with stories. Long, slow, careful stories from women who said things like, "I've never said this out loud, but my voice started to disappear the day. They called me difficult, but I was just..." Celine read them all. She didn't always reply. She didn't need to. Sometimes, knowing your words landed somewhere soft was enough. Lucas watched the change too. He told her one evening, while they washed dishes together, "You're becoming what you needed." She looked at him, hands wet, sleeves rolled. "I didn't think I could." "That's because you were told strength had to be loud." "It doesn't." "No," he said. "It just has to be real." They stood there for a long time, the dishes forgotten, the water running. Then Lucas leaned in and kissed the edge of her cheek, slow and quiet. Later that night, Celine wrote another entry in her journal, not for public eyes, just for herself. Strength is not the speech. It's the stillness before it. It's the moment after, when you don't flinch at your own echo. The next morning, she printed that line on a small note card and slid it into the back of each journal she'd be handing out at the next workshop, a quiet offering. No credit, no signature, just truth. She returned to her desk and opened her personal manuscript again. This time, she didn't stare at the blinking cursor. She typed, not pages, but enough. Enough to say, "I'm still here, still writing, still becoming." And nothing about this moment needed an audience. Because for the first time in years, Celine wasn't proving anything. She was simply present. By the fifth workshop, Celine stopped preparing questions. She didn't need prompts anymore. The women who entered that space came already holding what they needed. They didn't want a guide. They wanted permission. That morning, one woman stayed behind after the others had left. She hovered near the windows, fingers curled around a cold mug of chamomile tea. Celine approached slowly, letting the moment breathe. "You don't have to say anything," she said gently. "I know," the woman replied, "but I want to." They sat in two chairs by the corner. "I used to be a public speaker," the woman said. Corporate trainings, keynotes. Mic'd up, lit from every angle. People clapped at my pauses. She smiled faintly, then looked down at the journal Celine had given her. This is the first time I've written something without imagining how it sounds out loud. Celine nodded. Feels different, doesn't it? Feels real. They didn't say goodbye with a hug, just a shared breath and a look that said, I see you. After she left, Celine stood alone in the middle of the room. The chairs still formed their usual circle, notebooks left on some seats, intentionally or not. The sunlight stretched across the floor in long shapes. She didn't rush to clean. She let the silence hold her for a while. Back home, Lucas was waiting, not at her door, he never assumed, but in the cafe across the street, 2 stools from the window. He looked up when she entered. Busy? No, she said. Full. He slid a cup of warm cider toward her. Sit. She did. They didn't need to debrief. They just watched the street move while they stayed still. A little after 7, Celine reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. What's that? Lucas asked. She passed it to him. He opened it slowly, pages of her own writing, printed and bound with a single black clip. Yours? She nodded. It's not finished, she added. It doesn't have to be. I think I want to share it. Lucas looked up, careful. With who? Not the public, she said. With the women who've come. Just them. A small print run. Nothing flashy. Just something honest. Lucas leaned back and exhaled. I think they'll feel seen. That's all I want. The next morning, she reached out to a local printer. A family-owned press that didn't ask for logos or marketing plans. She told them what she needed. 75 copies. Simple. Matte cover. Unbranded. When they asked for a title, she paused. Then typed, "This is what I didn't say out loud." When the box arrived 4 days later, she didn't tear into it. She sat with it, ran her hand across the lid, then opened it slowly, like a gift she hadn't thought she deserved until now. Inside, the books were clean, plain, her words on white paper, untouched by headlines. She cried for the first time in weeks, not from grief, but relief. Lucas read the manuscript cover to cover that night. He didn't take notes, didn't annotate. When he finished, he didn't offer praise. He just held the copy in both hands and whispered, "Thank you for writing this." At the 6th workshop, Celine placed a book on each chair before the women arrived. She didn't say anything about them during the session. She didn't introduce it. When the women found them, they looked up with silent questions. Celine simply nodded. Some flipped through immediately. Some clutched it like a secret. At the end, one woman stood. "Is this yours?" she asked. "Yes. And you're giving it away?" "I'm giving it back," Celine said, "because most of these pages were born from stories that sound a lot like yours." The room went still, a stillness they had come to trust. "I've never been in a space where quiet is treated like a complete sentence," the woman said. "Now you have," Celine thought, "and you can build your own." That night, Celine opened her email to find a note from one of the earlier workshop guests. It was only 2 lines. "You were the first place I didn't have to edit myself. That silence made me feel whole." Celine stared at it for a long time, then opened a new document, titled it Margins, a handbook for quiet builders. She wasn't writing a self-help guide. She was writing instructions for anyone who wanted to host their own spaces, circles, gatherings that asked nothing but presence. Lucas read the title over her shoulder. "You ready to let it grow? Only if it stays small in spirit," she said. "No merch, no slogans, no voiceovers." He laughed. "Deal." She reached for his hand. Outside, the city buzzed, but inside the loft, there was only room for what mattered. And Celine? She had finally learned the difference. The 7th workshop filled in minutes. Celine didn't announce it anywhere. She simply sent a quiet email to a short list, and within 10 minutes, all 10 seats were gone. She kept the circle small on purpose, not because she feared demand, but because expansion without intention felt like noise. Lucas understood. He was the only one who never suggested scaling, never asked about next steps, never used the word platform. He used words like feel, trust, and still. The morning of the 7th workshop, Celine arrived early, as always. She unpacked the journals, placed the teacups, and opened the windows just an inch wider than usual. It was warm that day. The air felt soft. She could feel it. Something had shifted. The women walked in like they already belonged there. They weren't tiptoeing into vulnerability anymore. They were choosing it. Some brought old journals, worn from daily scribbles. Some brought new ones they hadn't yet cracked open. One brought nothing, and that was okay too. Celine didn't teach. She didn't instruct. She welcomed. By the end of the session, a woman who had never spoken before stood. She held her journal tight to her chest. "My daughter left 3 years ago," she said. "And today was the first day I didn't feel like my grief made me unapproachable." No one spoke. They didn't need to. Someone reached out and held her hand. Celine looked around the room and felt it again. This wasn't her space anymore. It belonged to all of them. That evening, Lucas cooked. He didn't ask how the session went. He simply poured her a glass of chilled ginger water, placed a plate of roasted vegetables on the table, and let her sit in silence. After dinner, she handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "An invitation." He opened it carefully. A single card, ivory, embossed, "The Gallery of Quiet." Featuring photography by Lucas Stray, curated and introduced by Celine Ardell, he looked up slowly. "I thought you said no titles." "I didn't give myself one." He laughed. "I want people to see what quiet looks like," she said. "Not hear it, not read it, just see it." Lucas nodded. "I'll do it if we keep it small, always." They booked a local space. Brick walls, no spotlights, just natural light and chairs that didn't all match. Celine wrote the captions for each photo, not descriptions, just single lines. The photo of the cracked window read, "The air always found a way in." The empty chair, she didn't come back, but her breath still lives here. A photo of her hands, slightly blurred. Healing isn't always photogenic. The opening night had no speech, no podium. People wandered the gallery in silence. Celine stood in a corner and watched as strangers paused longer than expected in front of each image. Some cried. Some smiled. Some just closed their eyes for a second, like the photo had said something out loud. Lucas joined her near the last frame. "You made this possible," he said. "No," Celine replied. "We remembered it together." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. "This came to the studio today." She opened it. Inside, a brief message in uneven handwriting. "I walked away from my husband last night. Your image gave me permission." The one of the open door. Celine stared at it, then folded it slowly and placed it in her bag. Later that night, she sat at her desk alone, writing by lamplight. Not for a workshop, not for a gallery, just for herself. She wrote a line and underlined it twice. "Let your quiet move loud things." She didn't know what the next workshop would bring. She didn't care how many signed up. All she knew was this: she wasn't building a brand. She was building a room, and everyone who entered it left taller. 3 weeks passed before she scheduled another workshop, not because demand slowed. It hadn't. If anything, more requests poured in than ever. But Celine didn't want momentum to make the decision for her. She needed space between the work. She didn't want the rooms to feel transactional. She wanted each one to matter. In those 3 weeks, she wrote more of her manuscript. Not every day, but more often. She let the story reveal itself instead of forcing structure. She also met with a few small presses, ones that respected her boundaries and didn't speak in metrics. One editor asked if she planned to go wide. "No," Celine said plainly. "I'm not trying to reach everyone. I'm trying to stay honest." He blinked, then smiled. That's the rarest kind of reach. She left the meeting with no contract signed and no regrets. That afternoon, she stopped at a local florist and bought herself a single stem of yellow ranunculus. She placed it in a glass near her desk and returned to writing. Lucas came over that evening with paint on his hands. "I started something new," he said. She didn't ask what. Instead, she handed him a warm towel and poured him tea. He cleaned his hands, then kissed hers. "I like the yellow," he said, nodding at the flower. "Feels like softness with a spine." He smiled. "So, like you." They spent the night reading on opposite ends of the couch. Lucas fell asleep before her, head tilted, mouth slightly parted. Celine watched him for a moment, then opened her notebook and wrote one line. "Love that doesn't crowd you will always feel like a home with windows." At the next workshop, she welcomed 2 women who had flown in from different states. They didn't ask for photos. They simply said, "Thank you." One handed her a letter. Inside it read, "You showed me I don't have to narrate my healing for it to count." Celine added it to the others. She kept a small box now, wooden, unmarked. Inside were folded notes, torn journal entries, quotes left behind. She never reread them in one sitting, but sometimes she'd open the box late at night, pull one slip out, and hold it. Proof, not praise. A few days later, a major platform ran a headline. She went silent in court. Now her voice is changing women nationwide. Celine didn't react. She didn't post about it, didn't share. She didn't issue a quote. The piece wasn't cruel, but it wasn't careful either. They named the wrong reasons, framed her silence as accidental wisdom, made it sound like she had turned her pain into profit. They didn't understand. She wasn't selling healing. She was protecting it. That weekend, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar. "Darren, just 2 sentences. I finally understand what you did. It wasn't about me." She folded it once, then placed it carefully, not into the wooden box, but into the trash. Not from anger, but closure. Some stories don't belong in archives. They belong in endings. That night, she hosted a quiet dinner at home. Just 6 women, all from past workshops. No agenda, just a meal. They shared stories, passed bread, laughed about things that had nothing to do with grief. Celine looked around the table and thought, this is what I needed years ago. Not solutions, company. Before they left, one of them paused by the door and said, "You know what you're doing, right?" Celine tilted her head. "What? You're making healing ordinary again." Celine stood in the doorway long after they left, the breeze from the hallway brushing her arms. And for the first time, she let herself believe it. The next morning, she sat by the window, journal open, tea steaming beside her. She wrote the last line of her manuscript, then closed the notebook gently and whispered aloud to no one, "I am finished." And for once, that didn't mean empty. It meant full. She returned to the courthouse on a Wednesday, not for a case, not for drama, just to walk the hall. It had been almost a year. The floors were still polished, the windows still tall, the walls still echoing with the weight of decisions made between strangers who used to share homes. She stood outside Courtroom 12, the same one where she had once stood in silence while the world expected her to break. It was empty now. She walked past it slowly, her steps steady. There was no trembling this time, no need to look over her shoulder, no memory that could overtake her. She had outlived it. Celine exited through the same door she had left from that day. Same air, same light, only this time, no one waited with a camera, no one followed. She walked to a nearby bench and sat down. In her bag was a book, Lucas's gallery catalogue. He had printed a small run, and this one had a note from him written inside the cover. "You taught me stillness can carry a whole story." She ran her fingers over the inscription, then tucked the book away again. Across the street, a younger woman stood by the courthouse steps, clutching a thick folder to her chest. Her shoulders were tense. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She didn't answer it. Celine watched her for a few moments, then stood, walked across. And when she passed the woman, she slowed just enough to say, "You'll still be you after this." The woman blinked, Celine didn't stop. She just kept walking. Some words don't need follow. That evening, she met Lucas for dinner at a quiet Thai place tucked between a laundromat and an antique shop. "You went back," he said gently. She nodded. How did it feel? Like the chapter is really closed. Lucas poured her water. "You always knew when to turn the page," he said. "No, I used to reread pain like it would give me new meaning. But you stopped. I had to." She reached for his hand across the table and held it for a while. They didn't speak much that night, but the silence wasn't about what wasn't said. It was about what didn't need to be. Later, back at her loft, Celine stood by the window and looked out at the city. Lights blinked like distant invitations she didn't feel the need to accept. She turned on her record player. Soft jazz, nothing too slow. She poured herself tea. And then, without planning to, she danced. Just a little. Barefoot on her own floor, arms loose, eyes half closed. She moved in circles, not for rhythm, not for someone watching, just because she could. Lucas watched from the couch, unmoving, smiling. She didn't notice at first, and when she did, she just laughed softly. He stood, walked toward her, and joined. No choreography, just motion. Two people, circling something neither of them needed to explain. Outside, the city kept pulsing. Inside, they danced without music. Celine had always associated silence with danger. The kind that filled a room before someone said something cruel. The kind that wrapped around her after Calder's words were done. But now, silence felt earned, safe. She sat across from Lucas on the floor, her back against the couch, tea forgotten, knees pulled close. They were still in the clothes from dinner, but the world outside had dimmed into a deeper night. He looked at her with that gentle gaze that never asked, only waited. "You know what I kept asking myself during the divorce?" she said suddenly. Lucas shook his head. What? If they were all watching the wrong woman? If they thought quiet meant weak? They always do. Celine smiled faintly. Funny how they missed everything in the silence. The grief, the clarity, the freedom. He nodded slowly. "You ever think of confronting Calder?" She exhaled through her nose. "Used to, a lot. But then I realized he never really had the words I wanted, and I don't need apologies anymore. Not from him." Lucas leaned forward. "You don't want closure. I made my own." I think that's what closure actually is. Not waiting for someone else to give it to you. The room went quiet again. This time, it rested gently between them. Lucas stood and reached for a slim box from his bag. "I made something." Celine tilted her head, curious. He opened it. Inside was a photo, a black and white print. Her, sitting by the gallery window weeks ago, unaware of his camera. Her posture was relaxed, her face turned away, lost in thought, surrounded by soft shadows and light. "You look free in this," he said. She stared at it for a long time. "I look like someone who chose herself." "I know," he said. "That's why I printed it." She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Later that week, Celine visited her old neighborhood. Not the fancy townhouse she once shared with Calder. That was someone else's life. Now. But the bakery around the corner that always smelled like cinnamon and yeast. Mrs. Landry still worked there, still wore the same faded apron. "Celine Varelli," she said with a grin. "You still like the sourdough?" Celine smiled. "Only if it's still warm. It always is." They sat on the sidewalk bench with 2 thick slices and tea in paper cups. "You're glowing," the older woman said, peering at her. "What changed?" Celine took a bite. "I stopped asking what went wrong, started asking what I want now." Mrs. Landry chuckled. "Takes most women 20 years to get there. Felt like I lived 20 in one." "You did?" The sun stretched long shadows on the pavement. "You seeing someone new?" Celine looked down at her tea. "Yes, and no." Mrs. Landry raised an eyebrow. "He's new to me, but not new." You ever meet someone who lets you be exactly who you are, and still looks at you like you're the most surprising thing? I married him. Celine smiled. Mrs. Landry sipped her tea. I saw you in that video. The jet clip. Celine paused. You laughing. The wind in your hair. Everyone online had something to say. Some were mad, others proud. Celine's hands stilled around her cup. Do you know what I saw? The woman said. Celine shook her head. I saw someone who stopped waiting for the courtroom to define her. Celine blinked back something sharp in her chest. You're not supposed to know your worth only when someone leaves. You're supposed to know it even if they stay. The words landed like a gift, and for the first time in a long time, Celine didn't feel the need to prove or correct or justify. She simply nodded. Thank you, she whispered. That night, back at her loft, Lucas joined her on the rooftop. No wine, no music, just stars too dim to fight the city lights. He wrapped a blanket around them both. Do you ever miss who you were before him? He asked. Celine leaned her head against his shoulder. No, I miss who I thought I had to be to survive him. Lucas didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew that woman was gone, and the one who replaced her, she wasn't louder, she wasn't harder, she was clearer. She was still, and stillness, Celine had learned, could move everything. Calder stared at the photo on the front page. It was a freeze frame from the viral video. Celine, on the jet, laughing, carefree, surrounded by wind and light, and a man they couldn't quite identify. The headlines didn't name her. They didn't have to. Everyone knew who she was. He set the paper down and leaned back in the chair inside his office. The silence in the room didn't feel like Celine's. It felt worse, not deliberate, not dignified. It felt empty. Across from him, Warren, his publicist, sat frozen, unsure whether to speak. Say it, Calder muttered. Warren cleared his throat. The board wants you to pull back from media appearances. Temporarily, Calder rubbed his jaw. Because my ex-wife is happy. Because your image depends on the story you told the world about her. And that story's unraveling. He laughed once, bitterly. You mean the story I sold? Warren didn't correct him. Calder stood, walked toward the window, and looked down at the city he used to control with a single phone call. Now his name moved slower. His shares had dipped. His legacy had cracks. Not because Celine spoke, but because she didn't. And in that silence, people started seeing. He hadn't heard her voice in months. Not since the last court appearance. She hadn't begged. She hadn't raged. She hadn't cried. She simply left. And somehow, that ruined him more than any headline could. The next day, he visited the art gallery again. The one she'd once mentioned loving, but never had time to visit when they were married. Now it had a waiting list for private viewings, and her name was listed as curator on the minimalist gold plaque outside. He didn't go in. He watched from his car. People came and left with prints, smiles, and stories. Inside, he caught a glimpse of her once, moving slowly across the floor, in a simple, soft dress, explaining something to an older couple. She looked peaceful. He looked away. Later that night, Calder met with his mother for dinner. She'd always been his fiercest defender, always blamed Celine for being too sensitive, too quiet, too unwilling to play the game of public image. But tonight, even she looked tired. You saw the video? He asked her. She stirred her tea without answering. Why do you think it got to me? He pushed. Her spoon paused. Because she looked like she never needed you to begin with. He inhaled sharply. And because it's true, he stood abruptly. I made her everything she is now. His mother looked at him then, truly looked. No, you made her invisible. She built everything you see now from what you left behind. Her voice didn't rise. It never had to. Calder left the dinner early. That night, he walked through the penthouse alone. The space felt colder, not sterile, vacant. Not because Celine was gone, but because the parts of her that used to soften the edges were never allowed to stay. Her piano, sold. Her reading chair, removed. Her favorite mug, thrown away out of spite after she didn't return for it. He sat in the kitchen, poured himself a drink, and let the silence stretch. It didn't feel powerful anymore. It felt like a mirror, and what he saw in it wasn't a man in control. It was a man left behind. And for the first time, Calder Royce didn't want power. He wanted presence. But presence couldn't be bought, and it never begged to return. Celine stood behind the glass of the gallery's back office, watching the soft blur of evening guests filter through the space. The exhibit theme was stillness in movement. It was ironic. Her life had been full of noise until she stopped speaking. Now she found movement in stillness, the kind that shifted her world without force, without fight. A young girl approached the reception, pointing at a canvas. Celine smiled faintly as her assistant walked over to explain the piece. Art did what people often fail to do, made silence feel alive. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it. No name, just a number she hadn't blocked. She didn't answer. She already knew the apology wouldn't be for her. It would be for the consequences. When she got home later that night, she set down her keys and found a handwritten envelope at her doorstep. Her building didn't have a doorman. Only two people knew her new address, her lawyer and her sister. This was neither of them. Inside was a note. No preamble, no signature, just two sentences. I know now that silence isn't weakness. It's strength loud enough to dismantle everything I lied to build. She folded the note and placed it in her drawer. She wouldn't reply, but for the first time in a long time, she believed he meant it. The next morning, Calder sat across from one of his investors, Gregory Harrow, a man who didn't tolerate noise. "You said she was unstable," Gregory said, eyes sharp, "that she broke under pressure." "I was wrong." Gregory raised a brow. "You admitting that for the press or for yourself?" "Both." There was a long pause. "Your silence in court spoke volumes. Hers is speaking louder." "I know." Gregory leaned back. "You know what speaks the loudest in my world?" Calder braced himself. "Profit, and your numbers are down." Calder nodded once. "Then let me earn them back differently." "How?" "I want to rebuild my foundation. Quietly. Away from headlines." Gregory didn't laugh. He simply said, "Try starting by supporting the woman you used as a pawn." Calder showed up to Celine's gallery 2 weeks later. He didn't call, didn't ask for an audience. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply came to buy the largest piece in the Stillness in Movement series, the one she curated, not created. When asked for the buyer's name, he gave none. But Celine knew. The way he used to walk, certain but not demanding, told her it was him before she ever saw his back. She let him leave without greeting, and still, the piece was sold. She hung a quote in its place. "Some lessons are loud, others echo." That same day, the press released photos of Calder visiting a local community startup foundation, one Celine had quietly funded during their marriage. For years, he'd called it a vanity project. Now he was listed as one of its donors. He never made a speech. He never took the mic. He simply sat among the volunteers and listened. When reporters asked why he was there, he said 3 words: to relearn presence. The video went viral, but not for him, for the message. A message people knew was inspired by a woman who never needed a camera to prove her worth. Weeks passed. Celine continued her work. Calder continued to rebuild. They didn't speak, not because they hated each other, because real healing doesn't always come in conversations. Sometimes it comes in behavior, in changed patterns, in respectful distance, in mutual peace. Until one day, a package arrived at Celine's gallery. Inside, a small, quiet painting, unframed, no signature, just a simple image of 2 chairs facing a window, identical to the ones they used to sit in after long days, before power, before status, before silence became a weapon. Taped beneath it was a sticky note. No noise this time, just presence, if ever you need it. Celine smiled faintly. She hung it in the staff hallway, unseen by guests, not because she was hiding, but because not everything sacred has to be displayed. Some things are meant to be kept, quietly. without apology, without need to speak. The air was lighter, not because everything had healed, but because the storm had passed. Celine stood at her sister Nadine's kitchen window, watching the kids run through the backyard sprinkler. Laughter bounced off the walls like music. Not the kind you play loud, but the kind you miss when it's gone. She sipped her tea slowly. Nadine leaned against the counter beside her. "You look like yourself again. I'm starting to feel like her. Did he call?" Celine shook her head. "No, and I'm not waiting for that anymore." Nadine smirked. "That's growth." Celine smiled faintly. "That's peace." Later that day, Celine sat with the Startup Foundation team, reviewing upcoming projects. She didn't expect the knock on the door. She didn't expect her assistant to enter, holding a bouquet, not of roses or anything cliché. Wild sunflowers, roots still intact. A note tucked inside. For the woman who never needed to be watered, she blooms wherever she's planted. No name, no plea, just acknowledgement, just presence. She didn't cry. She simply placed the flowers in a vase by the window. They'd live, even without soil, even without him. Calder spent the following weeks not trying to fix things, just trying to be better. He showed up where no one expected him, not to be seen, but to support. Local school drives, community food runs, workshops on mental health and conflict resolution. He didn't make it about redemption. He made it about contribution. When asked why the change, he said, "Because silence without change is manipulation. And I've been silent in all the wrong ways." His board didn't love the new version of him, but the people did. And for once, he stopped needing to choose. He started letting go of who he had to be for others, and started becoming someone who could sleep at night. One afternoon, he passed a bookstore downtown and stopped cold. In the window was a display titled, "Women Who Chose Peace." One of the books was co-authored by Celine. She'd written an essay, not about him, not by name, but about learning to leave. It was titled, "When Silence Isn't a Weapon, It's a Home." He bought 5 copies, one for himself, one for his mother, who had quietly supported Celine even through the divorce, one for his office shelf, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, one for the Women's Center he now funded anonymously, and one for the day he might sit beside Celine again, if the time ever came, not to win her back, but to thank her for choosing dignity, for not breaking him when she could have. Celine's exhibit was reopening. This time, the theme was reconstruction. She didn't invite Calder. She didn't need to. But he came anyway, not during the grand opening. That wasn't his moment. He came days later, during the quiet morning hours. He walked the gallery alone. He took in each piece without a guide, no headlines, no camera, until he reached a small installation in the final room. No frame, no title. Just 2 pairs of shoes placed in front of a mirror, one pair visibly worn, the other brand new. Below it, the placard read, "When one learns to walk without apology, the other must learn to follow without entitlement." He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply stood until the lights dimmed and the museum staff asked if he'd like to leave a note in the guest book. He did. He wrote, "Following, not to be seen, but to stay near the truth I ignored." The woman at the counter folded the page gently, almost like she understood the weight of those words. He exited the building with no expectation, only respect. For the first time, his silence wasn't control. It was reverence. That night, Celine sat in bed with the guest book the staff brought to her. She saw the note, his handwriting. She didn't race to call him. She didn't fall apart. She simply whispered to the air, "That's how I needed you the first time." And for the first time in years, she slept with no weight on her chest. No questions. No what-ifs. Just breath. And the knowledge that her presence had shifted a man more than her words ever could. Sometimes, strength isn't in shouting. Sometimes it's in staying silent, long enough for the world to adjust to your absence. And when they do, if they come back, it's not to control you. It's to honor what your silence protected. Winter softened the edges of the city. Snow didn't fall harsh. It drifted like a slow breath, covering sidewalks and roofs in stillness. Celine walked through it without rushing, her boots making small, steady prints behind her. She wasn't headed anywhere dramatic. Not to a gala. Not to a confrontation. She was meeting Nadine at a small local cafe for tea and almond croissant. Life wasn't thrilling, but it was safe. And for once, she wasn't begging for peace. She was living in it. Inside the cafe, warmth hugged her immediately. She slid into the corner booth, her scarf still dusted with snowflakes. Nadine waved from the counter. "Be right there." Celine smiled. She liked the normalcy of it, the way days now passed without crisis. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a familiar coat, tailored, dark, hesitating by the entrance, colder. He hadn't seen her yet. He was placing an order, calm, alone, no entourage, no urgency. He looked quiet, not broken, not performing, just there. When his eyes finally met hers, he paused, then nodded, nothing more. He took his coffee to a table across the room, no attempt to join her, no display. Celine breathed in slowly. Nadine returned with the order. She followed her sister's gaze. "Do you want me to?" Celine shook her head. "Let him sit." Nadine raised an eyebrow. "Here? No. There. Let him sit in his silence." Half an hour passed. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When she got up to leave, she walked past him. He stood. "Celine." She stopped. He didn't rush the words. "I don't want to fix what I broke. I know it's not about that anymore. I wanted you to know that your silence taught me more than my world ever did." She turned slowly. Her voice didn't tremble. "What did it teach you?" "That power without presence is nothing." She met his eyes. "And presence without respect is noise." He nodded. "I know." For a second, the world paused. Then she offered a small, unforced smile. "Take care, Calder. You too." She walked out. No tension, no tears. Outside, her phone buzzed, not with a headline or crisis, but with a message from a school principal thanking her for sponsoring a new literacy program. She replied, "Always happy to help," then looked up. Across the street, Calder remained seated, sipping his coffee, and the weight she once carried, she let it go. 2 months later, she received an invitation, not to a dinner, not to a second chance, to speak at a women's conference. The theme? Silence as strategy. She stood before hundreds. No grand gestures, no dramatic speech. She simply said, "I never raised my voice in court. I never exposed him in the media. I never dragged his name into my new beginning. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. It's preservation. And it's a boundary no one can argue with." The room fell quiet, then erupted in applause, not because she destroyed him, but because she didn't need to. Back in her apartment that evening, Celine sat on the balcony. A letter rested beside her, unopened. He'd sent it the day before the conference. She didn't rush to read it. She let it sit. Eventually, she opened it. It was handwritten. "I know you owe me nothing. I don't want forgiveness as a gift. I only want you to know. I watched the video of you on that jet. You were laughing, not like someone escaped, like someone remembered how to exist. That laugh didn't hurt me. It reminded me what I ruined. And that pain, I needed it. Thank you for not returning the noise I once caused. I hear everything now." She folded the letter gently, placed it inside the drawer with no lock, no intention, just acknowledgement. She stepped back onto the balcony, not waiting for a future with him, not resenting the past, but fully rooted in the now. Because in the end, the viral video wasn't revenge, it was visibility. And Celine, she had always been her own story. He was just a chapter, a loud one, but not the final one. Some endings don't need sound. They don't need slamming doors or dramatic speeches. Sometimes, They come wrapped in silence, steady, unshaken, and final. Celine Varelli never screamed for justice. She didn't air recordings. She didn't host interviews or sell a tell-all. She simply walked into court and said nothing. And when she laughed on that billionaire jet, the world thought she was retaliating. She wasn't. She was remembering what it felt like to breathe without strategy. The truth is, the loudest part of her story wasn't the betrayal. It was the rebuilding. She didn't just leave a marriage. She rebuilt her identity. She didn't just move out of a home. She moved into peace. She didn't need Calder to fail to validate her worth. She stood, even when the world didn't notice. And when they finally did, it was because she was already rising. This story wasn't about vengeance. It was about power, real power, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't require spotlight to be valid. Here are the lessons she left behind. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest boundary you can set. Love that costs your voice isn't love. It's negotiation disguised as devotion. You don't need public pity to rebuild. You need private clarity. Power built on performance crumbles when no one is watching. Dignity can't be snatched, only surrendered. And Celine never surrendered hers. So where does that leave Calder? He didn't spiral. He didn't beg. He didn't explode. He simply sat with the absence and learned something his money never taught him, that presence without understanding is performance. That loyalty isn't owned, it's earned daily. That real partnership doesn't require strategy, it requires attention. And by the time he learned those truths, the silence had already spoken. Now, maybe you're watching this because you've been quiet for too long. Or maybe you're on the other side, wondering why someone's silence stings more than their shouting ever did. Wherever you are, hear this. You are not powerless because you're quiet. You are not wrong for choosing peace. You are not invisible just because you stopped explaining yourself. And your story? It doesn't end in someone else's misunderstanding. It ends where your peace begins. Just like Celine's did. Have you ever walked away, not with a scream, but with stillness? If your strength ever looked like silence, type "my silence wasn't surrender" in the comments. Tap the like button if you've ever learned that walking away quietly is sometimes the loudest message of all. And subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories, where we tell stories that don't just entertain. They teach, they heal, and they remind you what dignity looks like when no one is clapping.